November 19, 1274. Hakata Bay, northern Kyushu. You're a Mongol warrior standing guard on the beach, and you can hear the screams, not battle screams, terror screams, coming from the ships anchored offshore in the darkness. Your commander told you the Japanese were beaten, that they'd retreated inland after losing a third of their force in daylight combat. He said you'd rest tonight and finish them tomorrow. He was wrong. The samurai are here, in the dark, on your ships. This isn't a scene from a revenge fantasy. This was the reality of the night of November 19, 1274, when 600 samurai warriors violated every principle of honorable combat their culture had taught them and turned the Mongol invasion fleet into a floating graveyard. By sunrise, over 3,000 Mongol soldiers would be dead. By the following afternoon, when the typhoon hit, another 10,000 would drown trying to escape. The Mongol Empire, which had conquered everything from Korea to Hungary, which had never lost a major campaign, was about to learn what happens when you back warriors into a corner and give them nothing to lose. Before diving into one of the most savage night raids in military history, if you enjoy learning about the brutal realities of medieval warfare and the forgotten tactics that changed the course of empires, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. What you're about to hear isn't the sanitized version of the Mongol invasions you learned in school. This is what actually happened when the unstoppable force met an immovable object, and the immovable object cheated. While the Mongols were celebrating their battlefield victories and counting their captured territory in northern Kyushu, something was happening in the Japanese command structure that nobody in the Mongol camp understood. The samurai weren't beaten. They were learning. Let's be very clear about something the popular narrative gets wrong. The samurai didn't repel the first Mongol invasion through divine wind intervention alone. The Kamikaze typhoon that destroyed the fleet on November 20th gets all the credit in legend, but the real damage was done the night before. By samurai who abandoned centuries of warrior tradition and fought like assassins instead of heroes. To understand why this worked, you have to understand what the Mongols were facing on November 19, 1274. They'd just won. They de-landed at Hakata Bay that morning with roughly 40,000 troops, 23,000 combat soldiers, and the rest support personnel and Korean auxiliaries. They'd faced approximately 10,000 samurai defenders, and they'd butchered them. The samurai fought the way they'd always fought, individual champions riding forward, announcing their names and lineages, challenging enemies to single combat, seeking personal glory. It was beautiful. It was honorable. It was tactically insane against an army that fought with massed arrow volleys, coordinated cavalry charges, and explosive projectiles. The Mongols had composite bows that could punch through samurai armor at 200 meters. They had teppo, ceramic bombs filled with gunpowder and shrapnel that exploded on impact and terrified Japanese horses. They fought in disciplined units that responded to drum signals and gong orders, advancing and retreating as a single organism. And they'd been doing this for 60 years across 2 continents. By nightfall on November 19th, the samurai had been driven back from the beach. The town of Hakata was burning. The sacred Hakazaki shrine was destroyed. A third of the Japanese defenders were dead or wounded. The survivors had retreated to Mizuki, an ancient defensive fort about 14 kilometers inland, preparing for a last stand they knew they probably wouldn't survive. The Mongol commanders, Hindun, Liu Fuheng, and Kim Bangjeong, made the tactically sound decision to consolidate their position. Their troops were exhausted from a day of fighting. They were in unfamiliar territory. They'd achieved their operational objectives for day 1, secure a beachhead, test Japanese defenses, establish supply lines from the ships. The plan was to rest, reinforce, and resume the offensive at dawn. They returned to their ships anchored in Hakata Bay. About 900 vessels, ranging from massive troop carriers to supply junks to Korean warships. Thousands of soldiers went back to the ships to sleep. Thousands more remained encamped on the beach and in the captured town. They posted sentries. They maintained watch rotations. They did everything a professional army does when occupying enemy territory. What they didn't expect was that the Japanese were about to stop fighting like samurai and start fighting like something else entirely. Shift your perspective to the Japanese command post at Mizuki. The senior commanders present included Shoni Tsukayoshi, the military governor of Kyushu, and Otomo Yoriyasu, a veteran warrior who'd been fighting in regional conflicts for 30 years. These men had just watched the Mongol military machine destroy everything they threw at it. They'd seen their warriors die trying to announce their names, while Mongol arrow volleys turned them into pincushions. They'd watched explosive bombs scatter cavalry charges before they could close distance. They knew that if they fought the same way tomorrow, they'd lose. Tsukuyoshi made a decision that would save Japan but violate every principle of bushido, the samurai code that defined honorable warfare. He called for volunteers for a night raid, not a battle, a raid. Strike the enemy while they're sleeping. No formal challenges, no announced names, no quarter given. 600 samurai volunteered, not the youngest warriors seeking glory, experienced men, men who understood that honor meant nothing if Japan fell to foreign invaders, men who could put aside their cultural conditioning long enough to become killers in the dark. The plan was brutally simple. Small boats would row silently out to the Mongol ships anchored in the bay. Boarding parties would climb aboard and kill everyone they found. No horns, no war cries, no warning, just blades in the dark and fire in the holds. While the ship raids were happening, ground forces would hit the Mongol encampment on the beach, targeting command tents and supply areas. This brings us to one of the most underappreciated aspects of samurai warfare. These men were trained from childhood in multiple weapons: katana, tanto dagger, yari spear, yumi bow. They were comfortable on horseback or on foot. They could swim in full armor. And when necessity demanded it, they could move with the silence of professional assassins because they'd spent their entire lives training physical control and mental discipline. The night was moonless. November in Kyushu meant cold winds off the ocean and choppy water that masked the sound of oars. The samurai had darkened their armor with mud and soot. They'd wrapped the oars of their small boats with cloth to muffle the splashing. They approached the Mongol fleet from multiple directions, dozens of small boats converging on different targets. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. Please comment below to let me know where you're listening from, and if you're enjoying this deep dive into the night that changed the course of the Mongol invasions. The first boat reached the first ship around midnight. The Mongols had sentries posted, but they were watching the shore, expecting a conventional attack if the Japanese tried anything. They weren't watching the water beside their own ships. The samurai climbed up the hull, using ropes with grappling hooks, moving slowly enough that the guards above couldn't distinguish them from the natural sounds of a ship at anchor in rough water. The sentry on the first ship died without making a sound. Tanto blade through the throat from behind. His body was lowered silently to the deck. Then the samurai were aboard, and the slaughter began. Close quarters fighting on a ship at night is chaos in its purest form. The Mongol soldiers sleeping below deck woke to screaming and the smell of blood. They scrambled for weapons in pitch darkness, while samurai who knew exactly where they were and what they were doing moved through the confined spaces like deadly ghosts. The corridors of a 13th century Chinese warship were narrow, maybe a meter wide, with low ceilings. Perfect terrain for katana work at arm's length, terrible terrain for composite bows or organized defense. The samurai weren't trying to capture ships. They were trying to kill everyone aboard and then burn the vessels. Every ship they destroyed was supplies the Mongols couldn't use, reinforcements that couldn't land, and most importantly, escape routes that no longer existed. Within 30 minutes, 5 ships were burning. Within an hour, a dozen. The flames spread because the samurai were deliberately setting fires in the holds where the Mongols stored their supplies, including arrows, which created spectacular secondary explosions when the fire reached them. The harbor lit up like daylight, and that's when the Mongol commanders realized what was happening. They tried to organize a response. Drums beat out assembly orders. Commanders shouted for their troops to repel boarders. But coordination at night, across dozens of ships, with some vessels already burning and others under attack, while the defenders couldn't distinguish friend from foe in the darkness and smoke, was impossible. The historical records, particularly the Moko Shirai Ekitoba, the illustrated scrolls commissioned by Samurai Takezaki Tsunaga, who fought in the battles, describe Mongol soldiers jumping into the freezing water to escape the burning ships. Many of them drowned because they were wearing armor and couldn't swim. Those who made it to shore found more samurai waiting for them. While the ship raids were happening, another force of samurai had struck the Mongol encampment on the beach. The attack hit the command tents first. The Japanese had identified where the senior Mongol officers were quartered based on the guard concentrations and the positioning of banners during the day. Those tents became the primary targets. Liu Fuheng, one of the 3 Mongol commanders, died in his tent. The sources aren't clear on exactly how it happened, whether it was an arrow through the tent walls or samurai who cut through the back and stabbed him while he was sleeping. But by the time his guards realized they were under attack, he was already dead. The loss of a senior commander in the first minutes of the raid threw the Mongol response into immediate disarray. Here's where the numbers become important. The samurai raiders numbered around 600. The Mongol force in total was 40,000, but they were dispersed. Some were on ships. Some were in the captured town, some were at the encampment, and crucially, most of them were asleep when the attack hit. The raiders didn't need to fight 40,000 men. They needed to kill as many as possible before the Mongols could organize, and then disappear before numerical superiority could be brought to bear. The raid lasted approximately 4 hours. From midnight until the first light of dawn was enough to see clearly. In that time, the samurai killed an estimated 3,500 Mongol soldiers, not wounded, killed. The casualty ratio was approximately 60-1 in favor of the attackers. The samurai lost around 60 men, mostly in the later stages when the Mongols finally organized defensive formations and the raiders had to break contact. But the real damage wasn't the dead soldiers. The real damage was psychological. The Mongol army had never, in 6 decades of conquest across Asia and Europe, experienced anything like this. They'd fought night battles before. They dealt with ambushes. But this was different. This was an enemy that had been beaten in conventional combat and responded by changing the rules entirely. If you made it this far, you're a true history enthusiast. Please verify your subscription now. It really helps the channel keep these forgotten stories alive. What happens next proves that warfare isn't just about numbers and tactics. It's about willpower and the ability to make your enemy believe they're not safe anywhere. By dawn on November 20th, the Mongol commanders faced a strategic nightmare. They'd lost a significant portion of their transport fleet. Their supplies were burning. They had thousands of casualties, many from drowning or fire rather than combat wounds. And most importantly, they had an army that was exhausted, demoralized, and now terrified of what might happen the next night. The sources indicate that Hindun and Kim Bangjeong, the surviving commanders, held an emergency council aboard the flagship. The debate wasn't about whether to continue the invasion. It was about whether they could continue. Their original plan had called for establishing a fortified beachhead, bringing reinforcements from Korea, and launching a sustained campaign to conquer Kyushu before moving on to the main islands. That plan required secure supply lines and troop morale. They had neither. The decision was made to withdraw, not retreat officially. Withdraw to Korea, regroup, and return with a larger force. It was the tactically sound decision. It was also an admission that 40,000 Mongol troops couldn't hold territory against 10,000 samurai who'd stopped fighting conventionally. But here's where revenge becomes a cautionary tale about assuming divine intervention when human action tells a more interesting story. As the Mongol fleet prepared to leave Hakata Bay on the afternoon of November 20th, the weather turned. Clouds rolled in from the east. The wind picked up. And by evening, a full typhoon was bearing down on the strait between Kyushu and Korea. The Mongol ships were designed for river and coastal warfare, not open ocean storms. They were flat-bottomed junks built for cargo transport and troop carrying, not high seas navigation. And many of them were already damaged from the night raid fires. When the typhoon hit, the fleet disintegrated. The casualty numbers from the storm dwarfed the night raid deaths. Conservative estimates put the number of Mongol soldiers who drowned at 13,000. Some sources claim higher, up to 15,000. Out of 40,000 troops who'd landed at Hakata, fewer than 20,000 made it back to Korea alive. It was the single worst military disaster in Mongol history up to that point. The Japanese called it Kamikaze, divine wind. The gods had answered their prayers and destroyed the invaders. The legend grew that Japan was protected by divine favor, that foreign armies could never succeed because the gods themselves would intervene. It's a beautiful story. It inspired Japanese resistance culture for 7 centuries, right up through World War II. But let's be clear about what actually happened. The typhoon was real. Typhoons hit that region regularly in November. The Mongols knew the risk, which is why they were trying to leave when the storm arrived. The divine intervention wasn't the storm, it was the timing. The Mongols were fleeing because the night raid had broken their ability to hold territory. If they'd still been confident in their position, they would have stayed on land and waited out the storm in the captured town, losing ships but keeping their army intact. The samurai won that battle. The storm just amplified their victory into something catastrophic for the Mongols. Now, Tsukayoshi, the commander who'd ordered the night raid, became a hero in Kyushu, but the sources are remarkably quiet about the specifics of his role. The Moko Shirai Ekitoba focuses on individual samurai actions, showing warriors like Takezaki Tsunaga fighting on the beach and raiding Mongol positions. The official shogunate records credit the Kamikaze and the divine protection of Japan. Nobody wants to emphasize that the victory came from abandoning bushido principles and fighting like ninja. This proves one thing that military historians understand, but popular culture ignores. Effective warfare and honorable warfare are often incompatible. The samurai won at Hakata because they were willing to dishonor themselves to save their country. They became assassins in the dark, killers of sleeping men, violators of every principle they'd been taught since childhood. And it worked. But here's where the story gets complicated. Within 7 years, the Mongols would return. Kublai Khan assembled an even larger invasion fleet, 4,400 ships carrying 140,000 troops. The second invasion in 1281 would make the first look like a reconnaissance mission. And the samurai would be ready, having learned from 1274 that conventional warfare couldn't stop the Mongols, but unconventional tactics could. Before we dive into what happens next, check out this video on the screen about how the Japanese annihilated the second Mongol invasion of 150,000 troops using the tactics they perfected after the 1274 raid. The second invasion makes this battle look tame by comparison. The immediate aftermath of the 1274 invasion changed Japan forever. The Kamakura shogunate ordered the construction of a massive stone wall along the entire coast of Hakata Bay. Over 40 kilometers of fortifications, 2-3 meters high, designed to prevent any future landing. They conscripted thousands of workers for the project, which took 6 years to complete. By 1281, when the Mongols returned, they found a coastline that looked like a medieval fortress. But the more important change was tactical. The shogunate circulated detailed reports of the 1274 battles to every major samurai clan in Japan. They analyzed what had worked and what hadn't. They trained warriors in group combat tactics rather than individual dueling. They developed special units for night operations and amphibious warfare. They essentially created Japan's first specialized military force. And when the Mongols returned in 1281 with their 140,000 troops, they found an enemy that had spent 7 years preparing for exactly this scenario. The samurai used the same night raid tactics that had worked in 1274, but on a massive scale. They built special boats designed specifically for attacking larger ships. They trained thousands of warriors in boarding actions. They turned Hakata Bay into a killing ground where numerical superiority meant nothing because the Mongols couldn't effectively deploy their forces. The second invasion lasted longer, about 2 months of fighting in June and July 1281, but the outcome was eerily similar. The samurai prevented the Mongols from establishing a secure beachhead. They conducted relentless night raids that made sleep impossible and morale unsustainable. And when another typhoon hit in August, the Mongol fleet was once again destroyed, this time with even greater casualties. Over 100,000 Mongol troops died in the second invasion, most from the storm but many thousands from the continuous Japanese attacks. Kublai Khan, who'd conquered China and established the Yuan dynasty, who'd subjugated Korea and Myanmar and Vietnam, who'd built the largest contiguous empire in human history, never attempted to invade Japan again. The cost was too high. The Japanese were too effective at asymmetric warfare. And there were easier targets elsewhere. This is why we study the Battle of Hakata and the night raid of November 19, 1274, not because the Kamikaze saved Japan, but because 600 samurai proved that tactical innovation beats numerical superiority. Because they showed that adapting to your enemy's strengths is more important than adhering to traditional doctrine. Because they won by becoming something they despised, and then living with that choice for the rest of their lives. The legend of the divine wind is beautiful. It gave Japan a national myth of divine protection that sustained them through centuries. But the truth is more useful. The truth is that the samurai won because they were willing to fight dishonorably when honor would have meant defeat. They abandoned centuries of warrior tradition in a single night because survival mattered more than glory. Consider hitting that like button if you've made it this far through the story of how 600 samurai annihilated 3,500 Mongol soldiers in 4 hours of darkness, and then let a typhoon take credit for the victory. Subscribe for more deep dives into the battles where tactical innovation defeated superior forces and where the real story is more interesting than the legend. Picture this one last time. It's November 20, 1274. You're a samurai warrior standing on the beach at Hakata Bay, watching the Mongol fleet flee toward the horizon. Your armor is covered in blood. Your sword has notches in the blade from striking Mongol armor and ship timbers. You spent last night killing men in their sleep, burning ships, violating every principle of honorable combat you were raised to believe in. And you won. You saved Kyushu. You stopped the invasion. In 7 years, you'll do it again on an even larger scale, and that time the world will remember it as the greatest military disaster in Mongol history. But right now, as the clouds gather and the wind picks up and you realize a storm is coming that will finish what you started, you're thinking about the men you killed last night, not warriors who died in honest combat, soldiers who died in their sleep. You dishonored yourself. You became an assassin instead of a samurai, and you do it again without hesitation because honor without victory is just a beautiful way to die. The Mongols learned that lesson the hard way at Hakata. They came with 40,000 troops, expecting to conquer Japan the way they'd conquered everything else. They left with 20,000 survivors and a newfound respect for enemies who would do absolutely anything to win. The divine wind gets the credit in the history books. But the samurai who raided those ships in the dark, who killed sleeping men and burned supply vessels and disappeared before dawn, they're the ones who actually won the battle. 7 years later, they'd do it again. 4,400 Mongol ships, 140,000 troops, and the same result. Because the lesson of 1274 wasn't about divine intervention. It was about asymmetric warfare, about night raids and coastal fortifications, and an enemy who refused to fight the way you expected them to. The Mongol Empire conquered half the known world, but they couldn't conquer Japan. Not because of divine winds, because of 600 samurai who were willing to become something other than samurai for one night, who chose victory over honor, who saved their country by violating everything their culture taught them about how warriors should fight. That's the real lesson of the Battle of Hakata. That's the story the Kamikaze legend obscures. And that's why, 7 centuries later, military historians still study what happened on that moonless night when the samurai stopped being samurai long enough to win. If you think this battle was insane, wait until you see how the Japanese annihilated the second Mongol invasion of 150,000 troops. That video drops next week. The tactics they used in 1281 make the 1274 night raid look like a warm-up exercise. The Mongols came back with everything they had, and the samurai were ready.